Welcome back to another episode of the Mindsets podcast. I am your host, Angus Cook. We're now through quite a few episodes here, but I'm very, very excited about today. I'm joined by Liv Thomas, who, as you guys know by this point, is going to take over and do her own introduction. However, I'll say hello again. As Angus Cook, as the host of the podcast, we've gone through a bit of my background, which is varied sport. And the reason that I started this podcast was a bit of my own mental health journey through sport, but also meeting amazing people that play various different forms of sport and compete in lots of different forms of exercise. And it's a chance for me to bring you guys into the conversation with some of those amazing people. And talking of amazing people, as I said, we have Liv Thomas here. So Liv, do you want to give us a bit of an introduction to yourself?
Sure. So I'm Liv Thomas. I play lacrosse for England and GB, but also alongside that, I'm a dual career athlete, so have a career on the side. I also, just under a year ago now, tore my ACL and meniscus and needed ACL surgery. So from that side of things, I'm going to run through today a bit about the mindset behind that, and my recovery back to full fitness, hopefully in the next couple of weeks.
Amazing. So it's nice that we're having the conversation on the nice end of this thing, because obviously it's a bit of a tough time. It's good that we're at the back end of that. But there's quite the journey in terms of sport before we got to lacrosse and the eventual injury. So I've done some digging and I've gone back through different things that are available on the internet. It's actually really scary, by the way, guys. You can find a lot about someone. But what is your sort of story with discovering sport? I'm aware that you started playing a few different sports when you were in sort of secondary school, but did it go back well before it then as well?
Yeah, so my parents are fairly sporty. My mum used to eventing and was very horsey. My dad was rugby. So from a very young age, been watching sport or just like surrounded by sport. Then I've always been very competitive. So at school, when I was whatever age you start playing sport, 5, I don't know, was playing any sport that I could possibly play, but didn't really get why at that stage. So I think one memory that I have is that we started doing cross country. Everyone hates cross country, but I went home one day and I said to my dad, I was like, oh, I can't be bothered to play. I can't be bothered to run or do the cross country. And he goes, you know, if you enter competitions and win, you could get a medal. And I was like, oh my God.
Changed the game.
Oh my God, a medal. This was like 7-year-old Liv thinking I could get a medal. And then I think that's the point where I remember the light kind of switching on, and I suddenly became this extremely over-competitive person that wanted to play every single sport possible because I thought I could get a medal in every single sport. Obviously now the medal is nice, but it's not the reason why I do it. But I think that's where my competitiveness and just love for sport came, because I was sometimes winning, but also started to enjoy it as well. So
that's really cool. Did you have much success in getting those medals?
Sometimes. I think now cross country probably isn't my strongest place, but yeah, I think I did occasionally, and then moving on into senior school, started to pick up the things that I was good at, and then kind of, yeah.
Do you know what I think is really funny as well? When I was younger, I used to go over to friends' houses. Everyone would have their medals in their bedroom or like on a shelf somewhere in the house. At what age is it no longer acceptable to have certain things on show? Like having an 8-year-old, 9-year-old medal for like football or like running, something like that. I think I took down when I was like mid-teens, because I was like, this is really like uncool. But even now, like I find them in boxes when I'm like back at my mum's. I'm like, oh, do you know what? That's really cute.
I'm pretty sure that on my curtain rail at my parents' house, every single medal I have ever won is still on there. This is like judo, cross country, rugby, like any medal that I've ever won. You just like look back through the years. So I hate to admit it, but I've never taken them down.
Do you know what? I like that. You've stayed committed with it. And I'm sure you've won many other things along the way. And on that story, I found some information about one of the schools you went to, which I believe is called Stowe.
Yeah.
So Stowe put out an Instagram post, which they tagged you in, which is how I found this. But they said that amongst an announcement of you making it into the national squad for lacrosse, they mentioned that you also had a successful time playing centre for them in lacrosse. You also played rugby sevens as fly half. You had a good career there as a swimmer, and you also held the junior and senior javelin records for the school. That's a lot. Do you want to talk me through each of those? Because you've obviously only continued with the lacrosse since then.
Yeah. So when I started at Stowe, played every sport you can. So hockey, netball. I think I played a bit of cricket with the boys. Tennis, swimming, rugby sevens, even played basketball. So I think I was thrown in. I wanted to play as much as I possibly can. And I continued to play a lot of those sports throughout. So obviously javelin carried on doing, and athletics carried on doing, lacrosse carried on doing. But at a certain point, you kind of have to go, right, what am I actually good at and what do I have a potential to exceed in? For me, that was lacrosse, and I knew it was lacrosse from an early age. So if I wanted to have the exposure to play with the senior teams, I had to drop off some of the other options, which I think is sad because I would have liked to carry on playing them. But if I wanted to be able to achieve what I have achieved, that was the decision I had to make. So yeah, had exposure to lots of sports at school, which I'm very happy about, and glad I did. Yeah.
And in terms of facilities to train and play all of those, I'm aware, when you're typically in sort of secondary school, you don't have like a training program for all of those sports. But if your school's got the facilities, did you just play all of the sports and playing all of the sports benefited your performance in each one? Or did you actually have some sort of training that you were doing on the side at that age?
I think I was lucky enough that I had a lot of that support at school. So we had like a performance program for sports scholars, which I got a sports scholarship to go to the school. So having that support definitely helped. We had the coaches that helped us in all of those. I actually did javelin in the school before, which is why I carried on doing it at Stowe. But yeah, I was lucky enough that we had all the facilities, all the coaches and stuff at school. So I didn't really have to go that much outside of school to get that, which was beneficial.
Awesome. One of the questions I want to ask you is, you said you were playing cricket a little bit with the boys.
Mm-hmm.
I get the impression that you're quite competitive. So I want to know from your competitive nature what that was like in terms of, was it challenging? Was it quite enjoyable? Did you not see anything different about it?
So before I started at Stowe, I played a bit of county cricket for girls. So just like we were young, it was anyone's sport he really played. Obviously some of those girls are now doing really well in cricket, but for me it took up too much time on the weekend, so I couldn't end up playing lacrosse. So then when I went to Stowe, played a bit with the boys, but like I'm not as strong. You can't be as strong as them. Like, and then you get to a certain physiological point where they are just physically better than you. So I think that got a bit frustrating. They were some of them were very happy to have me on the team, but I then thought, let's focus on some other sports that I enjoy more. And you can't do everything. It's not possible to do everything. So yeah.
Okay, so from there, as you mentioned, it was fairly obvious for you that lacrosse is where you wanted to go.
Yeah.
So did you start streamlining and cutting out the other sports gradually, kind of working towards the back end of secondary school, kind of sixth form time?
Yeah, so at Stowe I started in year 9, so I was 13 going 14. And then in my second year, so year 10, I had the opportunity to play with the firsts. So I was 15 playing with the 18-year-olds. And that was a huge opportunity for me, but it meant that I had to stop playing netball, stop playing hockey. But at that time, I made the decision that lacrosse is what I want to do. So I made that decision. So those two dropped out. Then in the summer, the first couple of years, I carried on playing tennis as well as doing athletics. But then as I got to sixth form, I thought, right, what is going to help me the most get better at lacrosse? And there were some things that I wanted to improve. So like my fitness and my speed were two things that I wanted to improve. Playing tennis isn't going to help those necessarily. So I thought, right, I'm just going to do athletics in the summer, nail my speed. Obviously, I did a bit of javelin on the side. But I think that decision really has helped me now with like my speed and fitness. So some of it gradually came out, but some of it I made the executive decision to drop, so then it would help and facilitate the lacrosse side of things.
Okay, and going through kind of from, you said year 9, all the way to uni, where you went to Exeter, did lacrosse play a factor in choosing Exeter, or was Exeter just up there and that's where you ended up going for your course?
My whole university choice was revolved around lacrosse.
Wow, okay.
So obviously the course was important, but the lacrosse was the most important thing for me. I wasn't going to go to a university that didn't play lacrosse. That wasn't an option. I've looked around some universities that previously lacrosse was good, but now it's not so good. So that wiped off, not an option for me. So the there were 3 universities that when I applied were top universities for lacrosse: Nottingham, Exeter and Durham. Exeter and Durham were my 2 that I was umming and ahhing about, and then decided to go for Exeter.
Now, when you're considering that, this is something that I didn't do because I wasn't really sure what sport I wanted to do at that age. And I say not really sure what I wanted to do. I obviously never knew I was going to go pro because of that. But when it comes to looking at university directly for something sport related, were you choosing based on the facilities? Were you actually considering the coaching that you were going to receive? Were you considering other players that were already in the team? What kind of thing were you looking at?
I think there's obviously the BUCS, the British University Sport, and years prior to when I was applying, Exeter had always been in the top 3. So that was something that I looked at. Obviously looked at coaches as well. So there was a coach that had been there for a while, but she was actually leaving when I joined, but they had another coach coming in on board, and then he ended up leaving halfway through my first year, but then another coach came on board in my second and third year. So I had a coach. Some universities don't even have coaches for lacrosse. Like other sports, it's a given that you have a coach. For lacrosse, there's only so many coaches in the UK, a lot of which are at schools. So universities, especially being in Exeter, it's quite difficult to pull people from London down to the south coast. So we were very lucky to have a coach. So that was a big part. Also, I got a sports scholarship to Exeter. So that was another pull. Gave me some extra funds to help with training costs and England finances as well.
So let's jump to when you're at Exeter then. Pretty much doing the sort of student athlete thing. How did you handle that whole situation? Because your course, I can imagine, was quite intense as well. But I know from personal experience, when you're committed to a sport, that doesn't mean that you just do the training sessions that are there. That means the gym sessions, that means the nutrition, that means cutting out some of those nights out. Some of them, sometimes you can't. But how did you balance all of that?
So in my first year of uni, that was the year of the Under-19 World Cup. So did freshers as a fresher would, and then from January, completely cut out alcohol. And I was like, right, I'm going to focus now on getting myself in the best possible position for me to be selected for the World Cup. So I was training loads. I was still going out, I just was sober. So I would be the designated driver taking people to the club, and I'd probably leave a bit early. No one would even know I'd gone. So then I'd just drive home. But that was really important for me. I wanted to get selected. I wanted to make sure my fitness was 100%, my speed was 100%. So I made sacrifices. But I think it is tricky. In my first year, I definitely prioritised my sport over my course. Didn't do the best in first year, but I passed. So
that's all you have
that's
to do.
all you need. And then second year, halfway through was COVID. So I was at home for the second half of second year. And then third year was pretty much all online. I did go to Exeter, but didn't really have any in-person stuff, which was a bit tricky.
So with the sort of making sure that you got into the World Cup squad, that wouldn't have been your first appearance with the national team, because you'd actually been going relatively early on in your teens. Is that right?
Yeah. So I was in what you call the National Academy from about the age of 14, 15. I think Regional Academy 14, then National Academy 15. So had been in the programme for about 4 years and working up to that World Cup. There are obviously so many other talented players in that group, so you just got to do as best you can to get get there. And at that age was my main priority.
And in terms of selection, something you've mentioned is taking the jump and kind of skipping being a certain age within the sport. Why did you decide to do that?
In terms of...
Well, you basically decided when you... And COVID may have helped out with this because it gave you some extra time to kind of prepare physically, mentally to be at the level you needed to be. You opted... Was it the under 23? There's an under 23 team that you opted to not go for?
Well, you trial for both.
Okay.
So straight out the under 19 World Cup, a lot of people might have taken a couple months off.
Right.
For me, I just went straight into the trials for the senior team. And then you either go into the under 23s or you go into seniors. And I ended up going into the senior squad. And then they were already in their 4-year World Cup cycle for what should have been 2021. But then, because of COVID, got pushed out to 2022. And then I was lucky enough to get selected for the 2022 World Championships.
So it sounded like COVID, as we said there, gave you a bit of extra time. But what did you do training-wise through COVID? Because in the time where you can't actually play with your team anymore, you can't get drills in with other players, did you just go back to fundamentals?
Yeah, so COVID was when I started my Instagram account, which was just dedicated to fitness. And I basically just nailed the fitness and all my weights training. Did a bit of that CrossFit kind of stuff. I'd never really done it before. I'd watched all the movies and thought it was pretty cool. So did a bit of that because we had so much time. I was working out sometimes 2-3 times a day because I just literally had nothing else to do. Now looking back on that, I definitely wouldn't have the time to do that. So, but it gave me a lot more time to grow in certain places that I needed to. So fitness, again, the strength and the speed, I was just nailing that all day, every day. So definitely that helped big time. Big time.
And then going kind of through and getting into the squad, and you've actually been, in the last couple of days, you've just been announced as in the squad for the European Championships. Is that right?
Yeah.
First of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
It was quite cool to see that stamped on Instagram. But in that time, you did have an injury.
I did.
So talk me through how the injury happened and what actually the injury was.
Yeah. So coming out of the World Championships, I was probably the fittest, the strongest, the fastest, and physically the best I've ever been. Then less than a year later, I still felt fairly fit, and in that similar place, I was like, right, this is a time, like, I feel really good. I've just come out of the World Championships. Now let's build into Euros, let's build into the next World Championships, the Olympics in 2028. And then in end of May 2023, changed direction. No one was even touching me, and my ACL completely ruptured and I tore my meniscus. So for me, someone that does all their S&C, all their speed, like all training that I could possibly do to prevent injury, got injured. And that was just an absolute nightmare for me.
When the injury happened, and touch wood, I'm trying to find some legitimate wood for those that don't realize this plant is severely fake, so I can't touch that. But touching wood for everyone listening and myself, that an ACL injury and yourself doesn't happen or doesn't happen again. What does it actually feel like?
It was the most horrendous pain I've ever experienced in my life. It's something that is very difficult to explain, but I felt like a crunch and a snap, basically, and that my knee had basically dislocated. That's what it felt like. My knee had basically left my body. And then immediately obviously knew that something very bad had happened, just fell to the floor, grabbed my knee and was basically just swearing on the floor. Honestly, the amount of pain, I just can't even comprehend.
Have you had many injuries in other sports before, or like in previous?
Small, like little hamstring niggles, torn a ligament in my ankle. Honestly, nothing even compares to it.
So this is very, very severe.
Yeah.
And did you feel at that time, even though you've never had an ACL injury, were you like, yeah, that's my ACL gone?
I think just because of the prominence of the type of injury in women's sport at the moment, I knew it wasn't something light. Like, I could feel how bad it was. So I thought, it's probably going to be an ACL. So, and a couple of other people in the squad had also done their ACL recently, and so it was similar sort of, Yeah.
So what happened then? Were you taken to a hospital? Were you given MRIs? Were you then told that, yeah, you're done for a while?
So I went to A&E straight after it happened, and I knew that was a waste of time because I knew it wasn't broken. I could hear things internally. So I went to get an x-ray. Obviously, x-ray was all clear, showed a bit of bruising. And then they said that I need to see like a specialist, get an MRI scan. So I was actually due to go on holiday 2 days later. So I was like, right, I cannot go on a 2-week holiday not knowing what is wrong with my knee. So ended up emailing a surgeon, which my dad had actually seen previously, saying, is there any chance you have any availability tomorrow? Because I've literally done this to my knee and I'm going on holiday on Tuesday. So is there any chance? He literally replied like 30 minutes later saying, I have a last minute appointment tomorrow. Can you come and see me?
Damn.
So I ended up getting an MRI and an appointment with him the following day. Luckily, my knee hadn't swollen up too much, so you could see what was going on. And then I knew that I'd done my ACL and that I'd torn my meniscus as well and that I needed surgery. So, yeah, very lucky to have had that.
How long did you have to wait from getting that diagnosis to actually getting surgery?
So you basically have to make sure your knee is almost nearly back to normal. So for me, it was 4.5 weeks. That's probably the minimum end you want to be doing it. Some people it's way longer. So I had to make sure that my flexion was pretty much back to normal, that I could walk on it normally. The swelling was completely gone. And once, I think the day before my surgery, I had a check-in to check that I'd met those indicators, which I did, and then was able to have surgery.
What's the surgery like? Are you out cold for
Yeah,
that?
yeah.
Okay.
So for me, they took a hamstring graft from my other leg and then basically made me a new ACL. Wow. And then they also did something called lateral tenodesis, which is when they, I think, pull your IT band down a little bit to basically make your knee a bit more rigid to hopefully prevent doing it again in the future.
And then I assume, because, well, you've essentially let your knee get as close as it can to naturally recovering, and then you've just ruined your knee again using medical equipment.
Yeah.
What's the sort of recovery period that they gave you when you came out of surgery?
As in totally?
Yeah. So not like you'll be able to walk again, but like you might be able to actually get back on a field by this point.
So for amateur athletes, they sometimes say 9 months because realistically, you're not going to be doing very, very, very high intensity change of direction. You might just want to go kick a ball around in a field or something. So that's 9 months. If you're a pro athlete that is full time, like getting paid, they might also say 9 months because you're seeing a physio 5 times a day and you have exposure to that. For me, I'm kind of like an intermediate between the two because I'm obviously an international athlete, but I am also working full time and only see a physio once a week. So for me, that timescale was 12 months, and that's back to normal, playing fully internationally 12 months. And that was the timescale that I was working off in my head. Great if I can do it before, but that is like the long stop date for me is 12 months.
For everyone that existed, has been through COVID, right? When COVID happened and everything got taken away from you in terms of your sport, and I appreciate if you're listening to this podcast, there is a strong chance that you're interested in some level of sport, which means there is a strong chance it was taken away from you for a year. Imagine having that and then having that happen straight away again.
Mm.
That's got to have been horrible mentally.
Yeah.
As you said, you were in basically the shape of your life. And then it was all in a second taken away. Considering that you'd not dealt with something quite like that beforehand, obviously you were at a bit of a more mature point in your career. How did you cope with that?
To start with, it took quite a while mentally for me to understand like the why me, you ask yourself. Like I do everything possible to prevent the injury and it still happens to me. And then you start to go over in your head, like, what if I do it again after this 12-month period, which I'm still thinking about. Like if I did it again, yeah, it would be challenging mentally, obviously, and physically. But yeah, it was very hard to compete at the start. Now I've kind of like the last year has flown by. Like the fact that I'm almost nearly a year on is crazy, but in the early stages, I found it very difficult, and especially post surgery when I was couldn't really do anything for myself. I was on crutches. I had to ice my knee like 6 times a day. I couldn't carry anything. So you rely a lot on other people, and I found that very difficult.
Especially, I guess, being a competitive person, you kind of want to do everything yourself.
Mm.
Did you find working back towards that goal, though? Obviously, yes, it was 12 months. Did you find that there was a consistent development in terms of feeling better about it, or was it really up and down in waves of seeing some improvement, and then actually some days it was really bad?
So the initial period was, because I had my meniscus repaired, I couldn't bend my knee past 90 degrees for the first 6 weeks at all. Then from 6 to 12 weeks, I couldn't weight bear past 90 degrees for 12 weeks in total. So I couldn't ride a bike for 12 weeks at all. I couldn't really do much, like even sitting down to go to the loo. Like I had to do a pistol squat every time I wanted to go to the loo. So that was frustrating.
I can't pistol squat, actually. It's worth me saying. Like if that happens to me, I'm now terrified that I won't be able to go to the toilet. That's good to know. Okay.
But yeah, in the early stages, it was easier to see change. So you had those markers. So from 6 months, I was able to do a bit more, and my quad started to grow. Like it went from literally being a twiglet to then growing substantially very quickly. But I think as soon as I got to like the 4-month mark, those noticeable changes weren't as much. So like my quad definition wasn't getting much better, or like my weight level as in strength wise wasn't getting much better. So for me, I was like, why am I not improving? But I was improving, but in a different way, or like maintaining the strength. So for me, I wasn't seeing those physical markers, and that was frustrating. So yeah, I got a bit frustrated in the middle phase of the recovery, because I was like, why am I not seeing any more improvements? I've still got 8 months to go. Like that's a long time. So that middle chunk I found really difficult.
And did it actually end up taking the full 12 months?
Well, I'm now like 11 and a half months. So okay. Yeah.
Pretty much. Now with getting back into the sport, one thing that I've always felt with injuries, and I have had my fair share of injuries through sport, is while you can actually get out on a field and you can be okay, and everyone tells you, yep, you're fine, you've recovered, you should be able to do this, no problems. You might have done some exercises which give you the confidence that you should be able to. I have always had what I would now refer to, and I'm coining a phrase here, an injury hangover, where you mentally don't trust the injury, even though you've had medical professionals say you'll be fine. Just purely from the point of fear of doing it again, but also fear in knowing I was fine before it happened the first time. And now I'm not 100% fine. What is actually going to stop it happening again? It's something I've always struggled with. I don't want to put that thought in your brain, but like, is that something that you've thought about as well?
I've definitely had that thought. And that was probably more, not now so much, but like when I first started to return to doing change of direction and stuff like that. But I think for previous injuries I might have had where they were like 3-month recoveries or stuff like that, the amount you can do in 3 months is very little. The amount I've done in a year is huge. I'm probably stronger than I was before, in terms of I've been nailing the rehab for both knees. I know I've only done it on one knee, but you do everything on the other knee as well. So I think I am physiologically stronger than I was before. I've done everything I possibly can in the last 12 months to get me back to where I was. Whereas for the 23 years prior, I hadn't been doing a lot of that stuff. So I am now confident that I'm in a place where I shouldn't re-injure. So in order to return to play, you have to mentally return to play as well. It's all very good being physically ready to return to play, but if your head's not there, then you shouldn't return. So I think I am in that place where I feel mentally fine. But yeah, probably when I first started to play, those thoughts were definitely happening, like, oh, am I going to redo it? Oh, that felt a bit weird. And yes, I do get very frustrated at the moment that I can't do what I could do 12 months ago, but it's coming.
It's good. It's good. One of the things I want to touch on is based on lacrosse, where we've obviously kind of gone through your career. We've not gone deep into the depths of lacrosse, but we've talked a little bit about how you wanted to improve your speed, your change of direction, that kind of thing. They were things that you focused on. we should probably do a bit of an explanation of lacrosse, because I think some people are aware of what it is, but not the depths of it. Now, to my knowledge, and I'm going to make myself seem like the village idiot here. So it is originally not a sport founded in the UK. I believe it started in America.
Yeah, a Native American sport.
Amazing. So that's one thing. I would also say that a lot of American sports have a lot of change of direction in, typically. If you look at the top sports in America being like American football and basketball, that sort of thing, crazy amount of work goes through your knee joint. So there's quite a history of ACL injuries there. But as far as the sport goes, 10 players per team on the field.
Yeah.
We're getting nods so far, so we're doing well. And then one of the things that it kind of confuses me is I always try to compare one sport to other sports to kind of get the crossover. From the way that it looks pretty similar in some ways to hockey. Then the fact that you can go behind the goal is very ice hockey, but the goalkeeper can only stay within like a circle. And then there's some other players that can and can't go into different areas. Do you want to do a much better explanation than what I'm doing as to what the sport is?
So a lot of people that aren't familiar with lacrosse would call it hockey in the air. In terms of the size of the pitch, you have free ball movement. You don't have to just throw it backwards like rugby. It can go forward, backwards, wherever you want. In the traditional game, there's 10 players, but in the new Olympic format, which for 2028, there's 6 players. Yeah. So that's obviously added a bit more complexity, but let's stick to the 10-a-side game for now. The goalkeeper is the only person that really is allowed in the circle, but they can come out of the circle if they want to. Basically, the aim is you start with a draw, which is 2 people basically doing a 50-50 ball and trying to get the ball. Then you have 6v6 usually in the attacking end, and then you can go behind goal, as you said. And the aim isn't to try and score a goal as quick as possible. Like, there's lots of plays that go involved in it as well. But yeah, you want to try and score a goal into that square but triangular net. What else can I say about lacrosse?
In terms of positions, then. So obviously Stowe mentioned that you were a centre.
Yeah.
Now, is that pretty similar in terms of things as like a midfielder? So you do attack and some defence as well?
So a centre is the one that does the draw at the start.
Okay.
But you would basically have attackers, midfielders and defenders, and then obviously the goalkeeper as well. So it's 3 attackers, 3 midfielders, 3 defenders, 1 goalie. And yeah, the draw taker is the centre. But within those, like attack, midi, D, the defence used to, when you were really young, you had like the different positions. Now you're just all defenders. So there's not like left back or whatever. It's just defenders.
And when you're playing the sport, based on how it works, and as you mentioned, there's some plays, the way of defending, and this makes a lot more sense knowing that there's not positions, it looks like it's quite man-to-man marking or woman-to-woman marking, whatever you want to call it. But are you glued to one player? Do you eye someone up as you go on the field and you're like, they're mine for the whole game? Like centre to centre, stick together, or do you just pick up who's a dangerous threat?
You adjust to the situation, you pick up. Sometimes you're man-to-man marking, but that might change. Like if someone runs past you and you think they're going to go to goal, you'd swap or you'd double up. It completely is situational. You're not kind of marking one specific person.
Okay, and so then you obviously within your team probably have an idea of who you want to get the ball to shoot. Mm-hmm. But in high levels of sport, it isn't actually always about scoring. To an extent, you need to control the game. Mm-hmm. So in lacrosse, what is the kind of method used to control a game, just to keep the ball out of the other team's possession, really?
So after each goal is scored, you go back to the draw, and the draw decides who has possession. So as a draw taker, I would obviously say that the draw is a very important part of the game. If you win the draw, you win possession and you have the ball. So that, I would say, is probably a key part of the game to get possession and take control of the game.
And do you try and always work forward, possession-wise, work towards their goal to make the opportunity, or do you actually just take it as the game flows, and then when you get the opportunity, you take the opportunity more? I
think you would try and get it into your end so it's safer away from your defensive end, but you can spread out, pass it around. If you're limited time and you're winning, you might hold the ball, but you want to try and get some goals in. But only when there's certainty that you're going to get the goal.
Now, one of the questions I've got as well is at the elite level, what would you say is the biggest difference between elite level and your more sort of standard club level?
So different to other sports, the club level, most of the international players play for a club, as in those general clubs that you would see in rugby or whatever. So there are obviously some differences because you've got some people that aren't international players playing in those teams, but also you have got international players, so they do control the game or make it similar to the international games. But I'd say the club games are probably more like fast break, you get the draw, you score a goal, or there are obviously a bit more mistakes here and there, so it's a bit more up, down, whereas international games, maybe a bit more tactical because you play with each other a bit more and you're obviously trying to get gold medals. So yeah, that's probably a key difference.
Okay, so if someone wanted to get into lacrosse that feels that, do you know what, I'm great at changing direction and I've seen lacrosse, I've not really thought about it. What would your recommendation be for someone to actually get involved in the sport?
So there are a number of clubs around the UK. I think you can find them on England Lacrosse. They've got like find a club, and that's probably the best place to go, is just find a local club, get involved that way, and then you'll meet other people. There's obviously international players that are playing there, so if that's the route you want to go, then you'll be able to.
So what is it like being an international player at a World Championships or a European Championships? You might not be able to answer that one yet.
It's pretty surreal. We obviously came third at the last World Championships, which was great. And I've got a shirt hung up in my in the spare room with a nice medal around it.
It's not made it to the curtain rail.
No, not the curtain rail. It's framed. This one's
Okay.
better. But yeah, it's an unbelievable opportunity, and hopefully I'll have it again in the next couple of years. But yeah, it's on to have the crowd watching as well. Like in some of our games, there are a significant amount of people watching. We don't really get that in the UK as much. And to play against some people that I've seen on TV or like have been my idols previously, or play with people that I've watched as a young athlete, then being on the same team as them, that's pretty cool.
So I think what would be really good is, based on having hopefully some lovely listeners, and they've been very lovely so far, is to talk about some of the changes that we'd like to see happen with the sport, because you've mentioned there about the support and it not being quite the same in the UK. Mm-hmm. Where does the British lacrosse team or English lacrosse team play their a lot of their games?
We don't really have a home base, so the majority of our training is usually at Surrey Sports Park. But as a team, we're completely self-funded. We pay for all our training, all the flights, accommodation, kit, everything. So we kind of move around dependent on costs of training facilities. So we don't really have a home base. And
is there a team sponsor, or is there the opportunity for team sponsors?
We're looking for team sponsors. I'm lucky enough to have some individual sponsors that have sponsored me personally. But we're always on the lookout for team sponsors to sponsor the team as a whole and then help facilitate the costs of other players as well.
Fantastic. So if there's anyone here that sees an opportunity to sponsor a team that, I don't want to put any pressure on you guys, but you came third in the last championship and you're going to the European Championships now, which hasn't got America in there. So like, this would be a really good opportunity is what I'm saying. So that's one thing that I wanted to discuss. The other thing I wanted to discuss is obviously attached to your injury.
Yeah.
So first thing, I think there has been a pretty well-known increase in ACL injuries broadly with the development of artificial pitches. Because artificial pitches, for those that don't realise, while they're fantastic because you can play on them in all weather, they don't allow for, if you wear anything with a stud in it, as soon as that stud goes into the ground, that ground grips it, which is great if you're running straight. If you're trying to change direction, and this is something that I experience a lot in some of the sports I've played, then it doesn't let your foot twist like grass would. So if you think about your ligaments and the strength of your ligaments, they're pretty strong. Grass and mud hasn't got a chance of standing up to that. When you put your stud in the wrong area of a turf pitch, maybe an area that doesn't have much rubber crumb or is a specific type of texture, then unfortunately, in that split second, the turf might be stronger than your ligament. And that might just be because, well, you might have very strong ligaments, you might have done a lot of gym training, that kind of thing. in that specific body position, it's not. And that's when it can happen, which sounds like what probably happened in your case. So that's a very top level thing. The next thing is Leah Williamson, the England football captain, women's captain, made a big point about the footwear that women have access to. And this is something that was actually news to me. Women's footwear is actually based on a men's foot, which doesn't make a lot of sense. But immediately I can imagine that it probably doesn't have any benefit to the women's game because of the distribution and the power output in different areas. There's physiological differences. I would be incredibly interested as someone who's felt the direct impact of some of these things. What are your thoughts on this whole situation?
So there's obviously been like a pandemic of ACL injuries at the moment. Like even male footballers are now tearing their ACLs more than it's ever been before. Some people are saying it's because the level of performance is now just exceeding the levels that it ever has before. But then looking at women's, I can't remember the exact figure, but a large proportion of professional footballers were out of the last championships because of ACL injuries. And there's obviously a problem here that needs to be addressed, and there's a lot more stuff coming out in the news about it, and there's a lot more awareness being raised about it. But as you mentioned, surfers can obviously have a huge impact on that. I had special boots for 3G, which are supposed to give. They've got rubber studs that give with 3G, and I was wearing them when I tore my ACL, so they didn't make any difference.
Wow, okay.
There's also, for women, like if you're at certain stages of your menstrual cycle, you can potentially be more prone to tearing your ACL. Again, don't know if that was a factor, but it could have been. And then, yeah, the boots. I don't know how, like, it could... I know all boots are men's football boots, and there are some that are starting to come out that are women's football boots, but these are all tiny little factors that could potentially add to it. And I think it's important that we start to create boots for women, and there's an increasing number of women playing football, rugby, obviously lacrosse for my case, which is a very small portion of the women's sports players in the UK. But I think as they start to roll out with anything, it's all about marginal gains. If you can make that marginal difference, it hopefully will help. But yeah, for me, it was probably a combination of factors.
Yeah, I think as much as it's a great concern for a lot of players that are happening, because again, if we take the realistic approach is that depending on the sport and the way that sports can change so very quickly, an ACL injury and taking someone out of their career for 12 months can actually end someone's career if it happens at the wrong point. If someone hasn't, broken an international squad and they're kind of on the cusp of it, and then they lose their knee for a year, they may not really ever get that opportunity back. And I don't want to say that you're lucky when it happened, because I don't think anyone's lucky when they get injured. Plus, it would have had major sort of impacts on your preparation for the European champs. But it's a great concern that things are continuing to increase, and it seems like the level of what's being done about it doesn't quite match up. But more specifically, in terms of the development of women's sport, I think we're starting to see some really good improvements. But as you said, it's marginal gains at the moment. What I'm hoping is that they stack.
Yeah.
And they continue stacking. And so, again, if there is ever an opportunity for the following of this podcast to support the women's lacrosse team or any women's sports at all, please do message me through the podcast page or through my private page, and I will happily share any event. Because I think that's what needs to happen. There needs to be more awareness of what's going on, not just about mental health, but obviously about some of the sports as well. That's what we're here to promote. Now, in terms of reaching out to other people and having people message, we have a listener questions section. So we've had some lovely listeners come in with some questions. They're about various different things. So the first question comes from James. James has asked me, how did you deal with not playing mentally while, kind of going through your recovery and rehab? So I imagine you still stayed around the sport, but having to watch it and not be part of it.
I felt the early days of recovery and going to the squad weekends, I found that really challenging from a mental point of view. Like watching other people do what you should be doing is horrible. So from that point of view, I just tried to. I did distance myself a bit from lacrosse for a while, not fully, but just like not really watching it or not really looking on at anything to do with lacrosse on Instagram because it was just making me a bit upset. So early days, I found it quite challenging. Then as I started to be able to do a bit more, as in like change of direction or start to actually play or do some goals, it starts to get a bit more interesting. And that's how I started to manage it, because I was like, yes, they're playing sport or they're actually doing the lacrosse, but I'm actually able to do a bit more than sit on a camp chair on the sideline in the rain, which I was doing for a lot of the time. So yeah, it is difficult, but I set myself goals throughout my recovery. And when I met those goals, right, tick, on to the next. So that's probably, you've got to set yourself goals and also just be disciplined to get your rehab done. And sometimes I wake up in the morning, I'm just like, oh, I can't be bothered to do this. Like in the early days, I was having to do my rehab every 2 hours. I was doing rehab all throughout the day, some days twice a day. And I was also working. So just having the discipline and getting it done.
I think one of the things that's really difficult with rehab is it's long, it's boring. It's something that you don't want to do a lot of the time. But again, the quickest sort of way to motivate yourself is, do you want to be in that exact position again? And if you don't, then do your physio. And it's so easy to say, it's so much harder to do. I appreciate. But if you can hold yourself accountable, I imagine that will make a massive impact on how you feel about things as well.
Yeah.
So there you go, James. Next question is from Jake, which is kind of discussing a topic I wanted to move on to, which is Jake's question is about some of the padding and the goggles, the kind of things that you can wear when you're doing lacrosse. But ultimately, the question comes from the perspective of men's versus women's lacrosse, which actually, on the face of it, it's the same sport. It just looks very different. What are the main differences?
I would say they are pretty different sports. Men's sticks is slightly different. They've got a deeper pocket, so their propulsion of shot is much faster. They're obviously stronger as well, so the shot will be faster anyway. They can, from what I understand, like hit each other with the sticks, which is why they've got a lot of more armour and kit to protect them. We should probably have a bit more in the women's game than we do. Like a mouth guard and goggles isn't really going to stop you from getting hit in the head, but we have rules to prevent that. Whereas the men's game, they've obviously got rules, but they can literally just whack each other, or it's a bit more physical than ours.
Because I know that they have pretty much like a full face mask.
Yeah, like a helmet, and then...
Is there something in the women... Obviously, you said that there's some rules. Do you have to wear anything on your face?
I believe you don't have to wear goggles yet, but I have done for ages. I just feel a lot safer. And if you're going through a lot of people with sticks flying everywhere, it's best to protect your face. I've been hit in the face a number of times on my goggles, so if I didn't have my goggles, that would be my eye. As
a description for anyone that's not aware, by the way, a lacrosse ball is something that physios, and I have one downstairs, use to really get into those deep massage points. They are solid.
It's a solid ball of rubber.
Getting hit in the eye is absolutely something that I would never want to experience, so I would definitely be wearing goggles if they're available.
And it's not also the ball, it's sticks hitting you in the face. Like it's quite common, and usually umpires will see it, but they've not got 10 eyes, so they can't see everything. So yeah, you've got to protect yourself as much as you can.
And one of my questions here is, obviously you play the women's game. Because the men's game, as you say, is a little bit, is quite different. Do you actually have the same level of interest in the men's game, or do you find it a bit different to watch in terms of it's not really the same for you?
I watch when like we're going to a tournament and the men's are playing, but I don't watch it loads outside of like in person, for example. Like, it is very different, and obviously when I'm watching the women's game, I'm watching to kind of see bits that I can take from it. But the men's game is obviously very physical, and it is interesting.
One thing that I think the women should get credit for in their version of the sport is not only the fact that you've got less padding, which means there's a greater risk of getting hurt, but the cradle bit. of the stick. In the men's game, it's bigger. So like, yes, you can get a faster shot. But I've actually tried to use a women's lacrosse stick. I can't keep the ball in there. Like, you have to do this movement the entire time you're running. For anyone that's listening, I am actually doing the movement. You can see that on camera. I don't really know how to explain what it is, but you have to do that to keep the ball actually in the pocket, don't you?
As you're running, otherwise it will probably just fall out.
Which, that's like...
You kind of just get used to it. It's something that you just do. But yeah, when you first start, it's a bit weird.
It's genuinely, from what, like, watching videos, obviously people are very, very good at it. And so it just looks like it would sit there. It doesn't. It's really hard. So if you have the opportunity to play with that, I would suggest it, because it's quite a challenge in itself. Amazing. Cool. So the last question is regarding the Lacrosse Olympics 2028. Have you booked your ticket?
Well, I'm aiming to be selected. Hope so. It's obviously 4 years away, so big 4 years. I know earlier you were saying that there's no right time to have an injury, but I think the year that I had been injured was probably the best time I could possibly be injured. I've managed to make it into the European squad, even though the ACL injury was there. Next year, we've got the World Games, which is six-a-side, which is kind of the pre-bit before the Olympics. So for all the sports that aren't in the Olympics are in the World Games, I'm pretty sure, apart from a few that cross over in both. And then 2026 is the next World Cup, and then 2027 year off, and then 2028 the Olympics. So in terms of years that I could do my knee, this year has been a good one. But yeah, the next 4 years is going to be a big shift to hopefully get selected for those.
So with going with six-a-side, there's going to be huge differences tactically there. Are you playing on the same size surface, or is it all changed?
It's a smaller pitch. It's slightly more like basketball in the fact that when you score, the goalie then takes the ball and it goes the other end. It doesn't restart.
Okay.
So it is different rules completely, different pace of game. It's much more fast paced. So they're obviously hoping to make it more interesting for the people watching. But yeah, I love the six-a-side game. I love both of them. But yeah, I'm glad that the six-a-side version is there, because it can play to some of my strengths in terms of the fitness, speed side of things. So yeah.
Cool. Well, this moves us on to the next section of the podcast, which is the 3 pieces of advice. So what I like to do is, everyone that joins me on the podcast, I like to ask them for 3 pieces of advice that they would give to a younger version of themselves. So essentially, remove me from the conversation for a moment, and you can replace me with one version of yourself or multiple different versions of yourself. But I'd be interested to know what 3 simple bits of advice you would give to a younger version of yourself.
One thing that I always say is that I need to stop overthinking things. So would probably throw that to the younger person, to just not overthink things and just get on with it. A lot of the time, people don't actually care what you're doing. You just think they do. So yeah, just to get on with stuff and stop overthinking it. To be disciplined and not expect motivation to always be there. I think I listened to something that Chris Williamson said before, and also has been one of the sounds on my social media, that discipline is way more important than motivation. Like, discipline is needed to do everything. You don't need motivation. It's not always a thing that will come, but discipline is what gets stuff done. And I think that has been a huge thing in my injury, is that a lot of the times I've had no motivation to do it, but the discipline is what's kept me going. So yeah, I think you just got to be disciplined in terms of, if you're revising for exams, you might not want to revise for those exams, but you've got to revise for those exams. So having the discipline. And lastly, probably choose your words carefully, because you can't take them back once you've said it.
Okay. That's actually not true with the podcast. Like, if you say something that you don't want to on the podcast, I have editing skills. But what I will say is, so far we haven't needed to edit anything out. So Liv's been great. Now, before we move on to the final part, which is the previous guest question, one of the things I want to touch on is, obviously you have gone through an entire recovery story, but now taking a look at how different athletes train for different sports. This is a big thing that I like to cover on a podcast. How do you train to be the best lacrosse player you can be? What does your sort of training plan look like?
It would depend like where you are in your competition stage or phase. So before the World Cup, sometimes I was training twice a day. So waking up before work, training, doing a whole day of work, and then coming home and doing training after work, which I'm sure a lot of people do, but it isn't the easiest thing. At the moment, it's obviously I'm in rehab, so still, so working on trying to get probably 2 speed sessions in a week, 2 conditioning sessions in a week, and 2 strength sessions a week. Sometimes if I'm feeling horrendous, so if I had a really long day at work, I might just adjust it slightly and put an extra rest day in, but that's usually the standard. But yeah, pre-World Cup, it was pretty full on and trying to squeeze in as much as possible. Obviously, you've got to have a social life as well. So yeah, fitting it in around work, social calendar, but also prioritizing training.
And then so just for a quick glimpse into each of those sort of different sessions that you have, when it comes to like a strength session, what movements are you prioritizing there for yourself?
We don't tend to have like leg sessions, upper sessions. It's all kind of mixed into one. Some do a bit of both, but now with my knee, I'm doing a lot more single leg stuff that I might have potentially been doing double leg before, just to make sure that both legs are working equally. Also a lot of plyometrics and jumping. So I've got, I think, my 12-month post-op testing in a couple of weeks. Like they do testing on what are those things called, force decks.
Yeah.
To check that both knees are the same when I'm jumping and like landing forces are the same. So plyometrics has been in my program for a long time and will continue. Like my training will completely change post ACL because there are things that I know now that I need to nail in the future to prevent future injury.
Okay. And then you also mentioned speed sessions. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to a speed session, are you doing like longer distance interval training because lacrosse is a flowing sport, or are you doing just short bursts, sprint, change of direction sort of thing?
So those speed sessions are mainly focused on agility, like the speed mechanics and a bit of sprints, but rather than your conditioning interval stuff, that more goes into the conditioning training. So this is just like your mechanics, the change of direction work, like the actual sprinting side of things rather than, the intervals.
Okay, amazing. Now, one of the final parts of the podcast is this previous guest question. So in the last episode we recorded with Joe, who had a slightly different background. He has a background in international swimming, but also is now a financial advisor. So a bit of an interesting thing there. His question, though, is if you could do anything, why aren't you doing it now? So if there is a thing that is in your dreams or your pipeline, whether it's related to sport or not, that you want to do one day or could be doing, why aren't you doing it now? So what is it and why?
I think at some point I would like to go travelling properly. I didn't take a gap year after school. I didn't take a gap year after uni, just due to the fact that the under-19 World Cup was in my first year of uni and the senior World Cup was in my first year of work. So I haven't really had any time to take a year out. So at some point in the future, God knows when, probably when I've stopped playing lacrosse, I would like to go travelling somewhere. So,
is there anywhere in particular that's on your hit list of where you'd like to go?
Like Australia and New Zealand, probably. I haven't really put loads of thought into it because I know it's not really possible at the moment, but as and when it is, definitely will do that. But why am I not doing it? Because I don't really have the time at the moment. But
aiming for the Olympics, which I think is a fair excuse, really. The only thing I will say is if like doing Southeast Asia or anything is on your hit list and you're worried about not being able to train, I went last year. So anyone that's going to Southeast Asia and is worried you can't find a gym, I pretty much posted every gym that I've ever been to with a review of it. So
perfect.
As a why aren't you doing it now? You can. You've got all the gyms there for you on a list. But I'm serious. I'm not serious. Aim for the Olympics, and when you get that done, or like when you're done with lacrosse, then definitely get some traveling in.
Yeah.
Awesome. Now, I need to ask you for your question for the next guest. So what would you like to know from the next guest, knowing nothing about who they are or what they do?
I'm going to be a bit weird with my question.
I love that.
If you could be any cereal, or if you had to choose, like make yourself a cereal, like associate yourself with a cereal, what cereal would it be?
That's such a good question. Can I ask what your answer would be?
You can ask me this. The first thing that's popping to my head is a Weetabix mini with chocolate chip.
Really? Do you know what? I haven't seen those in ages. Do they still make those?
Yeah, they do. So I think
I might have to go out to.
I don't really know the reason why, but maybe because on the outside they look not that they look boring, but you know, when you put a bit of milk on them, and then they just like liven up. You get the chocolate chip. I don't know why that's me, but that's the first thing that popped to my head.
When you said it, I immediately thought of the cereals that I like eating.
Yeah,
like
maybe that's why.
But some of the cereals I like eating, I like because they have some nutritional benefits and everything like that. If we're being real, cereal is probably not the best thing for you to eat all the time. So if I'm actually just going to commit, I think my answer would be Cookie Crisp.
Okay.
That's like a throwback to my childhood of like something that was unbeatable and everyone liked. And so I think I'd go, Cookie Crisp. Yeah. I think I've actually got some downstairs. It's probably like out.
There we go.
Might have to have that for breakfast.
I did actually do a online application for a job once, and it said if you could ask any question to our CEO, what would you ask them? And I was like, well, let's think of something that's going to make me stand out. So I asked that question. Didn't get the job.
Do you know what? Do you know what that says to me? Not the right company.
Yeah, exactly.
If I end up being a CEO, one day if Mindsets goes huge and I'm a CEO, someone asks me that sort of question, you're hired.
You're in.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's what I was aiming for, but clearly a bit boring.
Well, if anyone else hears that question and thinks that Liv is a great person they'd love to work with, or in fact can reach out to you or the women's lacrosse team to get something going, get something works, make those marginal gains less marginal and larger, where can people find you?
So my personal Instagram is Liv Thomas Fit, also on TikTok, but our Team England Instagram is at Team England Lacrosse. We are looking for sponsors for the European Championships, but also in the future for the World Championships and the Olympics in the future as well. So if you're interested, please do get in touch.
Amazing. Now, one thing that's clear is if you're listening to this and you've missed that, you can rewind it, but you can also go to the Mindsets podcast page. Everything will be tagged so you can find them. You can also reach out to me and I can try and make sure you get contact as well. So if you're looking for the Mindsets page, which hopefully you are anyway because you want to follow along, then use the at mindsets_podcast. That goes for everything. So TikTok, you can even use that on YouTube, but obviously Instagram as well. And that's where you'll find things from previous episodes, more things about Liv coming up. So do keep an eye out there. Please do follow. Please drop a share. And if you want to give like a 5-star rating, you know, that would be also amazing. But it's been an absolute pleasure to have you here with us, Liv. And it's been an absolute pleasure to have all of you lovely listeners join us again for another episode. And I'm excited about the next one already because I want to know about those cereals.